Welcome everybody to this special DocuSign Momentum Connect Introduction and New Features webinar. We were planning to present this talk in San Francisco at our Momentum conference, but instead we are all here together via the internet. My name is Larry Kluger. I'm the lead developer evangelist here at DocuSign, and joining me today is Joey Penn, who is our senior product manager for Connect. So we've got a couple of housekeeping issues to take care of first, and then we're going to move into the discussion. The first issue to raise to you is about asking questions. So there's going to be two different ways to do that. The first is to ask a question by typing it into the question and answer window. And you're welcome to do that at any time during the session today. Just ask your question when it occurs to you. And then we're going to work on your questions during the Q&A session itself. The second method is something we're trying out on this webinar, which is during the Q&A session, you can click the raise hand icon, and then we're going to try out unmuting your microphone for you then to ask your question live. Now, when we unmute you, you then have a secondary task, which is to unmute yourself, and that way your microphone will not suddenly go live. We're not going to do that, and we cannot do that. So the first step is you'll raise your hand. We will say that we're going to switch to you, what name you've registered with us, and then we'll operate the controls here, and then you will get this pop-up where you can unmute yourself. And if we can't hear you, then we'll go on to the next person, because obviously all this also means that your microphone has to be hooked up and plugged into Zoom and so forth. Okay, the next issue is that we are recording this webinar, and we will be sending you a copy of the recording or a link to the recording in an email sometime next week is our plan. And in that email, we will also send you a link to the deck, to the PowerPoint deck, so you'll have that as a reference as well. Next item is that we're going to push out a poll to you right now. If you could just take a moment to answer the poll, that would be much appreciated. So this is our safe harbor statement. And if you have more questions about it, by all means, raise them during the Q&A period. Okay, so our agenda today is that we're going to have, our session will have talks, first by myself about Connect as it is now, and then also a talk by Joey about Connect's upcoming new features that he'll be discussing with us. So let's get into that right now. With Connect webhooks, they have many uses. I'm focusing on 3 of them here today. The first is that you sent the envelope, the DocuSign envelope, and you want to know what its status is. The second is automatic workflow processing. For example, if you send out a contract, once the contract's signed, then you want to automatically start the business process's next step, whatever that might be. And then the third example for you, and we have many customers doing all of these steps, we send out millions of Connect notifications every day, is an extension of the second one, which is auto provisioning. So in this case, after the agreement's been signed, again, this is a sales example, then automatically provision the new customer, employee, or partner, and so forth. So for example, Salesforce itself, one of our use cases, Salesforce itself is a large customer of DocuSign. And if you become a new customer of Salesforce, about 80% of the time, the contract is standard enough such that Salesforce automatically provisions that new Salesforce account for the new Salesforce customer after Salesforce receives the notification from DocuSign that the sales contract was in fact signed via DocuSign. And then in the other 20%, those are more specials where they have to handle things a little more manually. but it's terrific for your application to get that notification that the envelope has been signed or whatever is the particular event that you're looking for. So there's two general ways of finding out status. One is polling, and we really don't encourage that. We do support it though. And with polling, of course, you're simply, your application is simply asking us for the status of your envelopes over and over again. Now that's got a lot of issues. It's inefficient, doesn't scale. Remember also DocuSign has a maximum polling rate. So for any given envelope, we do not allow you to ask its status more frequently than once every 15 minutes. In addition, DocuSign has API call limits that limit your application to the total number of API calls it can make to us per hour. And we do not increase that call limit if you simply want to do more polling. Instead, the fix for any sort of issue like that is to switch to webhooks, to switch to our Connect product. Okay, so webhooks, many of you I'm sure have used webhooks or you know about them, but I'm also sure that many of you are more looking into it for the first time, or you're want more information about it. The trick about webhooks is that things are kind of backwards from the normal way of making a request to a software as a service company, which DocuSign is. With webhooks, there's two steps. The first is what I call the subscription step, or the configuration step. And you're saying to DocuSign, please tell me whenever the envelope becomes complete, which for DocuSign, if an envelope reaches the complete status, that means that it's fully signed, copies have been sent to everyone who is set up to get a copy, and so forth. And of course, we then acknowledge that. Then later on, DocuSign tells you, hey, the envelope is complete, and you acknowledge that you've received the notification, in this case by saying thank you, but of course I'll give more technical detail in a moment. Now, the first part, the subscribing to webhook events or envelope events, is done either through the API or through the DocuSign e-signature administration tool. And either way is effectively the same, and you then have things set up to receive notifications. Later on, the notifications are sent to you, sent to your program with an HTTPS post request. And so this is the bizarro world issue, which is that DocuSign is calling you. So now you are the server, and DocuSign is effectively a browser. Of course, it's an automated system. There's no human browsing to your computer, but DocuSign, in fact, is acting as a browser. And what happens is first the event occurs, then DocuSign makes an HTTPS post request to your web server, which we often also refer to as your listener. It's listening for events. And the request body of that post request is the XML event notification package. Now, your web server receives and then processes the event. And then next, your web server needs to respond back to DocuSign with the 200 success status code, which tells us that you, in fact, received the notification. And you can see this in the diagram on the right-hand side. The recipient signs, which, of course, is an action that happens with DocuSign. And then after about a minute, it varies, the DocuSign webhook system, which we call Connect, will send that notification to you, and you will then send back the response that you've received it. Okay, now we offer webhook subscriptions or configurations for both at the account level and at the envelope level. On the left-hand column, at the account level, the way you subscribe is either using the administration tool or the API. And what you do is you subscribe and say you're interested in the envelopes that are sent by some or all of the senders in the account. So you can list the senders in the account. Or you can just say by, if an envelope is sent by anyone in the account. Now, in terms of product factoring, this capability of connect at the account level is included with our Business Pro accounts and above, and it's also available for the standard accounts. And you can talk to your salesperson about that. In addition, this capability is included with all Developer Sandbox accounts, which are all free all the time for developing. Now, the other way of subscribing to a webhook event is at the level of an individual envelope. And we call this event notification. But in fact, it's part of Connect, and the logging is under the Connect section of the admin tool and things like that. In this case, the way you subscribe is when you create the envelope with the API, at that point, you include the event notification attribute in your request object when you're creating the envelope. Now, what this means is that, in particular, you can only do this if you're using the API to create the envelope. And if you're not using the API to create the envelope, then the only option for receiving a webhook notification is to do it at the account level. You subscribe to each envelope individually, so you cannot sort of set something up that then gets used over and over again. And with the prog factoring is that all accounts that have API access can do this. So the intention here is that there should never really be a need for polling. If you're able to use the API, then you can use the API when you send the envelope and include the event notification. So either way works fine. And then in both cases, what can you ask about? Well, you can ask about today, and Joey's going to have more info on this. You can ask about events at either the envelope level or the recipient level, or both. So in other words, you subscribe to a webhook, you can say that you're interested in more than one event. So at the envelope level, you can ask to be notified whenever an envelope is sent or delivered or completed or declined and or voided. At the recipient level, you can ask to be notified when an individual recipient reaches the sent state or delivered, completed, declined, and so forth. You can see the list here. Now, the last one, auto-responded, which means that we were able to detect that an email was sent to the recipient, and the recipient's email system or some intermediate email system sent back a automatic response that said that the delivery failed. If you're interested in this event, then you want to check in with our customer service. Depending on defaults and things, they sometimes have to flip a switch for you to get this event notification. And there's no charge for that kind of thing. Okay, switching gears slightly, let's now talk about your webhook listener, which remember is your server. Key thing to remember here is that your server is that's going to receive the notifications, must be a server on the public internet. So you are now hosting a machine on the public internet. It needs to be on the public internet because DocuSign itself is on the public internet, and DocuSign is going to be, remember, acting as a browser, making these post requests to your server with the notifications. So that's all good. And the problem, though, is that there's going to be the bad guys out there trying to do something as well. Now, there's different ways to organize having a server on the public internet, and that's not the purpose of this talk. Since many people want the notification to interact with other applications that are on premises or effectively behind their firewall, that's why I've drawn the diagram in this way. You could, though, for instance, have your server be on a AWS system or Azure or whatever else you want to do. The key things to keep in mind here is information security. And that's why you can see it's the first and fourth and fifth bullets here. Now, additional issue is performance. we have the ability, DocuSign is what we call a big performance system at this point. And so DocuSign, especially as your envelope volume increases, DocuSign can pump a lot of notifications at your server very rapidly, and you want to be prepared for that. So keep that in mind. Now, so you can appreciate that this is a big deal here to have a server on the public internet. And because of that, some customers are a little bit concerned. Now you can do this, but there's now an alternate way of handling it, which I'm also going to discuss in just a moment. Now, part of having your server just in general, no matter what you do, is that you want to authenticate the client. The client, remember, is DocuSign. So you want to make sure that these messages coming in from DocuSign really did come in from DocuSign and not from someone else pretending to be DocuSign, especially if you're making business decisions and doing things automatically based on these incoming messages. So we have quite a number of features that work very effectively to give you the ability to authenticate that the messages came from DocuSign. The first one to mention, and the most important one, is HMAC. You can set up your subscription, your webhook subscription, and include as part of the setup a secret key that you give us, and then we will use it to create an HMAC digital signature that we will include when with the notification message that we send to your server. And so if you're not familiar with HMAC, it's taking a what's called a cryptographic hash of the entire message that's being sent, and it's and also as part of this cryptographic process, the secret key is involved. And so the bottom line is that we create this HMAC signature and we include it with the message. And then when you receive the message, you can recreate the HMAC. You can then compare the HMAC that you've just now created with the one that accompanied the message. And if they're the exact same, then aha, you know that number one, it must have been DocuSign that sent it because no one else has that secret other than you and DocuSign. And believe me, we don't give that secret away. And number two is that it also guarantees that the message integrity has been protected, that the message did not change in the slightest from the time DocuSign created it until you received it. Let me actually update myself. The way we have it set up right now is what happens is you ask DocuSign for the secret, and DocuSign then creates that secret, a unique secret for you, and you at that point have it, and DocuSign also has it, and that's how we deal with the issues of transferring the secret back and forth. And the way you receive that secret is through the administration tool. So we recommend very much that you always use HMAC to authenticate the client. And then we have another authentication technique that we also suggest using, which is called basic authentication. And that terminology is from the web standards. And so we didn't invent it. It's called basic authentication. And that's the very simple name and password that can be set up inside of a web server. And of course, the client must have the right name and right name and password, or the web server blocks them right there at the web server level. And because we're using HTTPS, it's all encrypted, and we recommend that you combine these two authentication techniques, both HMAC, which is handled at your application level, and basic authentication, which is set up at your server level, at your web server level. And with basic authentication, in fact, you do tell DocuSign, you say this is the, I think it's called the region, I'm forgetting the term, and also the name and password, and that all gets taken care of. Now we have other older authentication techniques available to you. That's mutual TLS and a digitally signed SOAP style message. but these days I don't recommend them. The newer ones I believe are better for you. Okay, now you understand the issue of having your DocuSign webhook notification listener that's going to receive the messages behind the firewall, in the sense that you need to make what's sometimes called a pinhole in your firewall, or you can use a special technique called DMZ, demilitarized zone. All these things are complicated and tend to get the security people very excited. So we've come up with an alternative where you don't need to do any of that. And here's how the alternative works. What you do is you set up a Connect Listener microservice, and it runs on, for example, AWS or Azure or Google Cloud or whatever you want. And this microservice gets kicked off every time a message comes in from DocuSign. And what this does is a couple of things. The first is it checks the basic authentication HMAC, make sure that they're kosher. And then the next thing it does is it enqueues the message onto a reliable queuing microservice. Actually, it's probably not micro, just service would be the better term there. I'll update the slide. And so a reliable queuing service such as AWS SQS, which means simple queuing service, or Azure calls it Service Bus, and let me see, Google Cloud calls it the Pub Subsystem. Everyone's got something like this. And what happens is when the message is put onto the service, once it's, the service provides acknowledgement that the message has been received, at that point there is no chance that the message will somehow disappear or get lost, even if things are rebooted or suddenly lightning strikes, whatever. Everything is, it's reliable in the technical computer science sense of the word. Word. Okay, so then what happens at this point now, you've got these messages queuing up inside of, for example, AWS SQS. And the question now is, you've got what we call a worker application that wants to work off these messages and deal with them. So the way this works is your application runs on your server behind your firewall, and it makes use of a client SDK, software developer kit. And the good news here, the great news, is that the software developer kits for AWS SQS, for Azure Service Bus, and for Google, et cetera, these SDKs, what they do is they do not wait for a notification. Instead, they go outbound, and ask the queuing service, do you have something for me? Now, at this point, you might be saying to yourself, isn't this just polling? And the answer is not really, because these SDKs these days, they do tricky things like what's called, in fact, long polling, or there's some other techniques as well. And these are new, rather complicated to implement, but reliable once you figure them out. These are special techniques so that there's very low latency. You get the messages, you're notified of the messages right away, but you don't have to make any kind of a hole in the firewall or anything like that. So so I think this is pretty good. We've got some customers using this, and you're welcome to make your own decisions about it. We have example software is available for this on github.com/DocuSign, and the pricing is quite reasonable. With AWS, for example, they have what they call the free tier, and you can do 1 million notifications per month for $0. Main issue, of course, is that this is involving additional steps and so forth. And the other issue is that if you wish, DocuSign Connect can include the envelope's documents. However, that doesn't work in this situation because that would then cause the messages to become too large for these services. And so instead you send the message, you instruct DocuSign not to include the documents, and then you later make a API request if you need the documents. Okay, let's switch again and talk about pro tips that Joey and I have written up. It's available as a blog post, and obviously I'm discussing them here briefly. So the first we already discussed, which is use both HMAC and basic authentication. Always, number 2 on the left, always acknowledge the incoming notification messages. Now, sometimes a message will come in for an envelope, maybe for some other application that the envelope was created for, or you believe you've already processed that envelope, or whatever is the situation. If you receive a notification message, don't tell us, Connect, don't give us a 400 error that, oh, go away, because we'll just keep trying to send it over again. Instead, just ignore it. In fact, acknowledge it and then ignore it, then throw it on the floor and just don't do anything with it. Don't reject it. Don't reject it at the level of telling DocuSign that you're not acknowledging the message. Always acknowledge receipt. Okay, next one. Please do not process messages synchronously. So what that means is when the message comes into your listener, you should put them in a queue. And then once they're in the queue, you should then respond to DocuSign and say, yep, I got the message. And then whatever is your business process that operates off of that message, that business process can take as long as you want. Now, obviously, if you use the platform as a service technique, there's a queue right there, and so included, so that takes care of the queuing issue. But if you decide to build your own listener that's going to receive the notifications directly from DocuSign, that's fine. But as part of architecting that service, please install a queue. There's many, many queues. There's both open source and closed source. There's free products, paid products. Use a queue. Don't make DocuSign wait. Your goal is to respond to DocuSign within 5 seconds. Now, you can take a little longer than that, but that should be your goal. Okay, application user experience. Don't make the user wait for Connect notification. Figure out your application so that the user doesn't sit there twiddling their thumbs, because even though it only takes about, I'd say, from 45 to 90 seconds, depending on server load and various other things, that's a long time for someone to be sitting there. So you want to figure things out and notify the user later on of your application that whatever was happening that was waiting for the Connect notification has happened. Okay, next one. This recommendation is certainly softer. It's up to you, but we certainly recommend at least that you look into this idea of using the PaaS architecture. Next, this applies to everyone, is we recommend that you do not include documents in the Connect payload. You can do it if you're receiving the messages directly, but we don't recommend it. The reason is that DocuSign is making these post requests to your server. And post requests are typically, and the way the web was designed, the post request is typically the contents of a form. And so a form that the human filled in. So a post request can be very large, but the assumption of most web frameworks and everything else is that it's not going to be so large. And remember that if you tell DocuSign to include the documents, then we're talking oftentimes many megabytes worth of documents. And this can lead to all sorts of problems that I've seen with many, many customers. So the recommendation is you don't do this. Instead, if your application needs the documents, you simply make an API call to DocuSign. And at that point, the documents will arrive as a response to your call, and things tend to work a lot better for larger response bodies as opposed to request bodies. Okay, if you're looking through the XML file, and Joey's gonna have something to say about XML, right now, what you get is XML all the time. You should be careful to make sure that you're looking at the right data elements. In particular, the notification file has many different status elements. So if you want the envelope status, make sure you're looking for it, and not finding one of the other status elements. Lastly, you can debug by using a webhook debugging service. There's many of these available these days. or you can just do web server logging, because after all, you're acting as a web server. So it's very common to have web server logging. I'm going to turn it over now to my friend and colleague, Joey. Joey, I'm going to stop sharing and take it away on webhooks tomorrow.
Yep, absolutely. Just give me a second here, actually. Sorry, I just had a slight hiccup while bringing up the document.
While Joey's bringing up that document, remember that you're welcome to ask questions at any time using the old-fashioned typewriter technique. So just ask your question in the question box, and we'll use that to get us going during the Q&A period.
Okay, I shared my screen now. So let's spend a little bit of time just talking about kind of what's coming next for Connect. So the first thing is, we are working on kind of a V2 infrastructure. So what is this? So today's Connect, if you're a customer who is using Connect already, that infrastructure has been around for quite a while, many years. It was kind of created back in the day when SOAP was still kind of the go-to standard for interacting with DocuSign APIs. And has essentially been unchanged for many years. So when you look at the actual content, the XML content of the payload, you'll see that it basically represents an exact copy in the structure of our SOAP API. So it follows kind of the same definitions. And that's what we're showing here on the screenshot. This one here is basically an envelope. This is the Connect payload, and it essentially resembles the SOAP API's get envelope request. So inherently, this is not really a problem. If you're a customer who's using SOAP, this data is probably extremely familiar for you and probably easy to handle as well. The challenge here, however, is that this payload, again, following the SOAP principles, follows a very well-defined schema. And so what that means is that over time, as DocuSign has evolved and has included more and more capabilities, the payload itself does not contain that type of data. Right? It doesn't contain the new features and capabilities. Now, if you're choosing to use Connect just purely for the event notification, and then your system handles it there from there on, whether within your own system or by calling DocuSign's APIs, it's totally fine. Right, the updated content doesn't matter as much to you, but if you are looking to get the payload returning data that is, accurate, then depending on what features you use in DocuSign, this could be a little out of date. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about exactly what is going to be new in the V2 infrastructure that the current we'll call it the legacy payload, doesn't contain. So again, the big items are around new features. So if you're looking to have envelope flows that contain any sort of new feature in the past couple of years, this upcoming V2 infrastructure is going to be something that you'll need to take a look at. So talking through some of the examples, we've introduced a bunch of new recipient types over the years. These give you more capabilities for specific flows. So for example, witnessing, now there's a witness recipient type, which can go and confirm signing by someone else, but then doesn't really retain access to documents. So you have that logic built into DocuSign. If you're looking to parse that, you'd have to look at outside of the XML payload, either through an API call or this new payload that we're building. Conditional recipients, any sort of workflows related. Again, new feature of DocuSign. Conditional recipients essentially allows you to build complex rule-based routing within your envelope flow. So you can do things like, if department equals billing, then go to some XYZ person in billing. Or if dollar amount greater than certain amount, then get some BP approval, right? So these are all very recent and new capabilities built within the past year that would not be represented in the XML payloads. Now, moving outside recipients, there's also even things within the document. Some of you may be using Connect to fetch documents. Larry kind of advised that even if you have very large documents, you may want to consider otherwise, but I know for a lot of customers, archiving is an important scenario. And so document fetching as part of Connect is, a supported use case. But the current XML or legacy payload, the document that's included may have slight differences. Again, mostly aesthetics, but it's small differences due to features that have been added later. So watermarking is a very popular one. So this is one where, if you have a voided envelope, you'll have the little watermark that says voided across it. And so that's something that was been relatively recent, which doesn't exist. So just using that as an example. Then there are other features and products like ID verification, which is, again, very cool product. Just take a look at it if you haven't. Essentially allows you to verify an identity of a customer, when they're trying to sign. But that type of information, again, as part of the legacy payload, that type of information doesn't come back with the Connect message. So all of this essentially gets solved in the new V2 infrastructure, which we'll talk about a little bit. So features is a big reason for considering the new V2 infrastructure. But there are also other reasons. So for example, if you're using our REST API already, which is the majority of our customers today, maintaining a separate type of parser and object model for the XML payload, the legacy payload, again, it's more work for developers. So if you're using the REST API, the Connect V2 infrastructure is going to be very familiar for you. So let's talk a little bit about what this V2 infrastructure really looks like. And we have some screenshots to kind of show you later as well. So what is the high level concept then of this V2 Connect infrastructure? Right? We kind of took a look at the XML payload already of the legacy infrastructure. So what is this new infrastructure? So first of all is, it will essentially follow our REST API object model. So the important thing there is if you've used our REST API, whatever you're familiar with there from objects and parameters, you'll have it as part of the DocuSign Connect payload. It'll be the exact same. So that can simplify implementation in a lot of cases. Now the objects, again, all the parameters will be the same. For those who've used DocuSign's Connect, you would know that there's a lot of customizations you can do with the payload. So that includes things like, whether you want to include documents, whether you want to include the account IDs of the sender, whether you want time zone, or all these things that you can add and append to the DocuSign Connect object, so that it could be a very slim object just for notifications, or it could be very broad and include all the documents and tab data and all that sort of thing. So this continues to be true in the REST, this REST API model for the Connect V2. What that means is if you're using our REST API, again, V2.1 REST API today, you'll know that when you get statuses on envelopes, you can also request in a single API call to include data about the recipients, or about the documents, or about the tabs. So you have various different levels of customization to that payload. And so the Connect V2 infrastructure will essentially allow you to make the same selections. So a single payload could be very slim, again, just on envelope status, or it could be very broad and include things like the recipient, tab, data, documents, all that sort of thing. And we'll show you a screenshot of that in a sec. Now, the last thing is, because this is kind of all built on top of our REST API's object model, that means that all non-breaking new features, so essentially everything additional to what we have today, every new feature that gets added will automatically be included in the payload. So let's say that we introduce yet another recipient type in the future. If you decide to use that, that will automatically come through in the connect payload. Now, there are some things that don't change. So if you have, again, if you're an existing customer of DocuSign Connect, many of the things don't really change. It's mainly the payload that is changing. So what are the things that don't change? Security. Comments that we made about security, those don't change. You have the exact same security setup, which again, earlier we recommended HMAC. That continues to be the case under the new infrastructure. The envelope level or account level configurations won't change either. You'll be able to do both, though there are some slight differences in how that's set up, which again, I'll show you in a second. And then the best is to kind of help you move migration slowly. We will allow you to basically have both configurations at the same time. So things on the legacy and things on the new V2 infrastructure, you're free to pick and choose based on your own needs. We will not be removing the legacy payload. It'll be around for the foreseeable future, so don't need to worry about that. But at least now it gives an option so that our SOAP customers will probably prefer the older legacy infrastructure because they probably actually don't want any of the newer things since it's a standardized contract. And then for those who are using REST API, most likely you'll want to take a look at the V2 infrastructure. Okay, so let's quickly jump into a screenshot here. So this V2 infrastructure is launching very soon, probably within the next month or so. Right now, I'm just showing a screenshot to kind of give you a good sense of what's actually changing. So again, this is a DocuSign Connect configuration page. This is, most of the elements you'll see is very, very familiar with, very similar to what we have today. So, being able to set up an active connection, give it to your URL, which is again your server, having logging information, selecting which events to trigger on, right? Very essentially the same. So what is different is essentially the data format or the message payload. So if we switch over to the legacy, this is the options that you have today. And here's the sample payload that we had earlier. So you can see XML envelope status. Here's the type of data that you can go and customize and pick. So essentially we'll allow you to pick between the legacy, and I'm just gonna click on this, and the REST v2.1 object model. Here's what the sample payload looks like. So you can see it's essentially a copy of the REST payload for our enveloped object. We'll even give you samples within the product itself so that you can launch and take a look and see all the different fields that is contained and use this to plan your integration. And then in terms of the customization, you can see it's a lot. These are all the options that, again, for those familiar with the v2.1 API, these are all the options that would mimic the include parameter. So the include parameter is a new thing in the v2.1 object that allows you to fetch multiple embedded objects within envelopes so that you can do the, it's actually not just envelopes, but for envelopes specifically, you can get embedded objects so that you only need to make one API call to fetch the envelope and its recipients and its tab data and its documents and all that sort of thing. So if you're not using v2.1 for REST, there's another plug. Take a good look at the v2.1 capabilities and can migrate your v2 integration to the new API. Okay, and then lastly, so that's kind of the immediate thing that's coming up. Again, within the next month, you can expect to see communication, release notes, and any sort of public blog posts on this coming up very shortly. What else is coming up? So I'll talk about a couple other features that are that may be of interest for you guys. So the first thing is called Recipient Connect. So what is that? Well, today DocuSign Connect as a webhook system is used when you are the sender. Right? So your organization sent envelopes. You want to know exactly where your envelopes are at. Like, what is the status of it? And you want to be able to maybe hook into live workflow process of the second someone signs, something else happened in the background, whether it's archiving or starting a workflow in another system. So that's when you use Connect most of the time. However, we're finding more and more companies are now interacting and doing business together on DocuSign. That's great because now you have one-stop place for all of your legal documents. But what that means is sometimes you need automation when you're the recipient of an envelope. So you're not the sender. Someone sends you, other companies maybe send you a bunch of envelopes, and you need to do something with it. To automate that today, I mean, you really can't. You'd essentially have to pull DocuSign. So the extension of the Connect capability is to allow you to create configurations to handle kind of inbound envelopes. So not ones that you sent, but ones that you receive. So that's something that's coming. And then kind of even longer term, probably about a year or more out, is the addition of additional Connect event types. So today we have a lot of events on envelopes and recipients. People are still requesting more envelope and recipient events. So that's one type of expansion, but other folks have done deeper integrations with DocuSign. And so they're interested in things like account setting changes and user changes and all those sort of things. So that's going to be kind of a longer term item. So that's it. That's kind of the three top of mind things for what's coming up in Connect. Again, one very, very near term, one slight medium term, and kind of one longer term. That's kind of our roadmap going forward. If you have any asks in these spaces, in any of these three, feel free to reach out to us. I've included some contact information here. You can reach out to me directly to any sort of field contacts or AMs and whatnot. Or you can reach out to the developer evangelism team, such as Larry here on the call. Okay, that's it. And with that, I think we move into Q&A.
That's right. Thank you, Joey. What we're going to do now is, first off, please, again, take this time if you have a question that you want to ask to type it into the question window. The other thing we're going to do is ask you a second short poll. If you could take a moment to answer that, that would be helpful. So there'll be a live poll, and we appreciate your help with that. And then let's move to questions. So we have, let me see, we've got a couple questions that have come in so far. The first one is from Andy, and he says, we are subscribing when creating the envelope through the API. We seem to often receive delivered notifications, but then we don't receive the completed notification. So instead, we have to rely on polling to ensure that we get updates in a more timely manner. And this is all happening in the developer sandbox. Is this expected behavior? Joey, you want to comment on that? And then I think I may have a thought as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure that's the expected behavior on delivered and completed, since they're very different events. I assume here that you're talking about the envelope delivered, which is the beginning, and then completed in the end. There could be it could be that maybe the event isn't selected, but let's assume for a second that the configuration and whatnot is set up correctly. In that case, yeah, I mean, there could be potential bugs on this that you can file with us. We can actually look into the event logs. The other thing I would see to check is on DocuSign, you can actually see our failure logs and see if there's something happening with the message. we most likely can help you determine whether the message was sent, or maybe if the message wasn't sent, then, we'll figure it out. But if the message was sent, then maybe there's something with the listener, so your server, potentially rejecting that message. So, I'm sure this is something that we can probably help you kind of debug together.
What I would add to that is that our default queuing technique is what we sometimes refer to as aggregate notifications. So what happens, the default system is that if you are asking for both delivered and completed event notifications at the envelope level, for example, then because those tend to, well, they often happen right next to each other, let's put it that way, then you'll only get the latter, you'll only get one notification, not two. And when the notifications are sent with the envelope status at the time of the notification, not the envelope status at the time that the event occurs. So this can sometimes lead to some puzzlement in terms of what are the notifications coming in and why aren't I receiving the ones I was asking for. So a way to change that is the SIM queuing system, which we're bringing online, which makes sure that stands for send intermediate messages. And that way you're sure to get all these intermediate messages if you're subscribing to more than one event. The other half of this, and Joey can say more about SIM queuing, the other half of this is that as a best practice, I recommend that you only subscribe to the events that you really need. And that tends to help things run smoother on both sides. Yeah. Joey, you want to say anything about the SIM queuing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to assume that, in this case, the customer is subscribing to events that they need. For the SIM, we're happy to help you try it. Basically, it's a flag that you can just instantly turn on for your account. Again, or send every message is another name for it, if you've heard of it. But in this case, he's doing delivered and completed, which are typically do not happen in close proximity. So, it might be better to start off looking at kind of your own failure queues, again, within the DocuSign UI first, just to take a look and see if there's any issues. Again, we can help you try SIM, but most likely we would want to take a look at whether the message was actually delivered. So you can feel free to reach out to us through the field or your contacts.
Okay, good points. Next, Sanket, I apologize, I'm not pronouncing your name right, writes in and says, we process thousands of envelopes a day. Is there a mechanism to get notifications in bulk, or is it only at the envelope level? The answer is that notification, there is no bulk, and instead you'll get one, let me put it another way, you'll be notified about each envelope individually, and depending on which events you're asking for, you'll get one or more notifications about each given envelope. The good news is that we have many very large customers who are in the same situation, and it works very well for them. Key thing to keep in mind here is that you want to make sure you are properly configuring and architecting your server if you're going to be getting that level of traffic. And I would especially recommend, it's very, very important to have some sort of a queuing system, some sort of intermediate queuing system for when you're in that type of volume. Joey, anything you want to add on that?
Nope.
Okay. Next is from Joseph. Do you have an example of how you would use Connect for automatic user account provisioning? I'm sorry to say we don't have an example of that. Also, that really depends on how, it depends on your infrastructure. When I'm saying user account provisioning, I'm referring to if you make a application, if your business is a software service that has users, and after a customer signs a contract, they then end up with a provisioned user. That's what I meant in this example. And how you provision a user in your own system, of course, would be up to you. I would say the main thing to keep in mind is you want to have logging, you want to have statistics, you want to carefully understand the different scenarios so that if the person's new account should be provisioned automatically, it will be, and otherwise obviously sent to a human for manual provisioning. So thanks for the question. I'm sorry we don't have something more specific for that. We might do an example in the future. Next is a question, if we miss a notification will be sent again. Yes, it will be if you use the usual setup, which is to have each message confirmed and when it gets resent and so forth varies depending on which queuing system you have, but it will be sent again. However, I really urge you, the best thing is to immediately dump it into a reliable queue, and that way you don't have to worry about this kind of thing. I've worked with a lot of customers where they miss a message, and then the question is, why does it take a while to get a new one, and timeouts and all sorts of problems. Yeah. Another message here is from Margaret.
Larry,
go ahead, Joey. Yes.
Yeah, let me actually quickly jump in on the other one. So, if this is just about your web server being down or, you threw an error or something of that sort, then yeah, automatic retries will definitely help you. In the case that, maybe your web server did get the call and it did accept, but, maybe a bug or something caused it to error out and, you missed the message in that fashion, where DocuSign doesn't know that you ran into an error, you will not get the retry. So there is a way around that. DocuSign has a republish capability, both via the UI and the API, where you can select envelopes to republish, and it'll apply all the existing rules that you have set up, all the configurations, and rerun them. So that's like one of the options if you happen to miss something and it's not due to an error that DocuSign knows about.
Okay. Does anyone want to put up their hand for a live question with Joey and myself? Looking.
So we still have Margaret's question to answer here.
Sure. You want to take that, Joey?
Sure. Let's see. I'm a developer, not a web server admin. So the polls and setup you're talking about isn't something I can respond about. Should I be in this presentation? I guess an interesting question. A lot of the topics we have about DocuSign Connect as a webhook is typically for developers. Some of the setup may require a web server admin to kind of assist with, specifically in terms of setting an outbound reachable box. But the implementations here that we're talking about, analyzing the payload, which security mechanisms to use, those types of things are all kind of a developer-focused topic because someone needs to build on top of that web server, a listener that can interact. And the best practices, certainly many of the things that Larry talked about, including like using a queue and all that is kind of a developer side implementation. So yes, this is definitely a good topic for you. And if you missed a portion of it, we do have a recording for you to kind of review once we're done with this session.
Okay. Joe, you want to go on to the next slide, some resources?
Let's see, could you, so the next one is from Sagarika. Could you please provide some useful links for integrating the REST Connect API? Yep, so as I was saying, this is coming up in about a month, so I don't have any links for you right now. However, if you stay close on our any one of the forums that we communicate to customers, so either release notes, blogs, any of these content, you will get an update and information package available to basically everyone in about a month.
I'll add on to that, but in the meantime, Joey, could you go to the next slide in our deck, which has some resources?
Oh,
Well, I guess it,
you
that
want
one
to
doesn't.
maybe jump
So
in here?
let me share my screen so we can all see that. And one moment here. Mhm. Okay, so here's some developer resources for you. There's more Connect information available right now on our developer blog, so you're welcome to look at that. And I'd say the easy way to get to our developer blog is by going to developers.docusign.com. That's our developer center. And then on either at the top or the bottom, it seems sometimes it moves around, is our blog. So that is one good. So we've written a number of articles, both by myself and I've written some with Joey about implementing Connect, and those are available to you right now. These resources that we're showing here on the page is additional sources of information for you as a developer. And I want to point out the upcoming API office hours, May 7th and May 20th. Also, we have YouTube developer videos, which we continue to make more and more of. So you want to go there and subscribe. And lastly, let me focus my cursor here. We have 2 more of these Momentum Developer webinar series. The next 2 will be Wednesdays at 10 a.m. And so the next week will be our brand new DocuSign Monitor API, which enables you to receive security-related events that affect your DocuSign account and log them live in Splunk or whatever is your security monitoring system. We're also going to have a session May 13th specifically on creating embedded signing workflows, you can sign up for all these at docusign.com/API webinars. Let's see if there's any last person who's brave enough for us to hear their voice live today with a question. No, I'm not seeing anyone. Okay, so in that case, let's declare success. I wish you a good rest of the day wherever you are. And thank you so much for checking in with us and joining us today. Thank you and have a good day.